In 2010, as you know, the midterm elections went red in a huge way, not just at the federal level, but way more importantly than the Beltway acknowledges, the country in 2010 really went red in the states. Republicans gained hundreds and hundreds of seats in state legislatures after the 2010 election. There were more Republican state legislators in the country than at any time since 1928. In a majority of states, Republicans controlled majorities in the state legislature. In 16 states, Republicans had the whole legislature and the governorship. They had total control. And right away, among this new class of Republicans, it kind of seemed like they were all pursuing the same agenda. I mean, yeah, there were slight variations among the states, but they really seemed to be pursuing a lot of the same things at the same time all at once. They wanted to make voting harder, for starters, with 180 bills trying to make voting harder just since the start of last year. Last year, they introduced 600 new bills to roll back abortion rights. They enacted 92 of them. That was a record. They moved to give tax dollars to businesses. Even in states that had big budget deficits and couldn't afford to be giving money to anybody, they found lots of money to give to business interests. And after the red-tide elections of 2010, the new Republicans, who all seemed to be sort of acting in concert, doing all the same things, they went after union rights in a really big way. In Michigan and in Tennessee and in Maine, Republican governors with Republican legislatures just could not wait to go after union rights in their states. In the great state of Ohio, the Fox News personality and Wall Street guy John Kasich, who is the new governor there, he put his own John Kasich stamp on the anti-union agenda. In some other states, they would exclude cops and firefighters when they went after union rights. And that's, of course, because cops and firefighters tend to be sympathetic figures. And so who wants to alienate the voting public by going after their rights? But Ohio Republican Governor John Kasich did not feel that way about cops, at least. Not at all.
Have you ever been stopped by a policeman who was an idiot? I had this idiot pull me over on 315. Listen to this story. He says to me, he says, you passed this emergency vehicle on the side of the road and you didn't yield. He's an idiot.
Unlike some of his fellow Republicans in the class of 2010, Ohio Governor John Kasich had no qualms about going after cops and firefighters. He didn't think anybody would mind that. When Ohio Republicans wrote their law to strip union rights in the state, they included uniformed officers, too. They were also going to get hit just like everybody else. Now, the protests over this in Ohio were memorable. They were big protests, but, you know, it was interesting to be covering this at the time it was happening. I mean, given what John Kasich was doing in Ohio, and given how big the protests against this kind of thing were elsewhere in the country when all these other Republican governors were doing it, the protests in Ohio were big, but they were not incredibly big. I mean, in Michigan, people at the Capitol in Lansing said the protests there over stripping union rights, those were the largest protests they had ever seen in Lansing. The protests in Wisconsin were so big, they shook the whole country for months. But while the protests in Ohio were significant, they were not ginorma mega ultra big. I mean, the country did not stop to watch what was happening in Ohio. While the protests were going on, at the time, we kept hearing from labor activists and Democrats on the ground in Ohio that the reasons that the protests weren't maybe as big as you might think they would be, the reason they weren't putting all their resources into organizing the largest possible protests is because they actually had something else to do. They had another plan for reacting to the stripping of their union rights. I mean, thanks to Ohio law, people who supported union rights in that state had another option besides protest. Ohio's Constitution let them put the law that stripped union rights up for a citizen's recall before that law went into effect. So Ohio Republicans did pass this law that stripped union rights, but union rights were not stripped. There was a hold on it. The state's unions still existed. And in prepping for the recall of that law, the unions could play a role in organizing and funding and making their case against the new law. They gathered thousands more signatures than they needed. They put the law up for a vote. They did get out the vote efforts like nobody's business all over the state. And in November, Ohio went to the polls and they struck down that law by more than 20 points. So what happened in Ohio is that Ohio Republicans tried to kill the unions, and they failed. In this year's presidential election, Ohio is going to be a swing state again, like it always is, but the Democratic ground game is going to be in place, with strong unions ready to help fund ads and knock on doors and get out the vote like they always have. Democrats' greatest allies live in Ohio. In Wisconsin, it has been a very different story. In Wisconsin, the new Republican governor there, Scott Walker, and the new Republican legislature there specifically didn't include the law enforcement and firefighters unions that had supported Scott Walker in the 2010 elections. They carved those unions right. They carved the union rights of those workers out. So that was nice, I guess, for them, but it also had the effect of splitting the opposition in terms of people who liked union rights in the state of Wisconsin. In Wisconsin, the pushback to try to save union rights included, of course, huge protests, mostly at the Capitol in Madison, but also all over the state, and they went on for a very, very long time. Also in Wisconsin, the minority Democrats in the Senate fought back as hard as they possibly could. They fled the state to deny Republicans a quorum. They kept Republicans from passing the union stripping bill for 3 weeks while they remained in an undisclosed location. That was not so secretly actually just Illinois. But in the end, Republicans found a way to jam this union stripping bill through on just a few hours' notice. They just declared it done. The reaction in Wisconsin to what the Republicans did was electric. Protesters stormed the Capitol, filled the rotunda in the dark of night. Unlike in Ohio, supporters of union rights in Wisconsin didn't have the Ohio option. They did not have the option of stopping that law with a recall. The way the Wisconsin state constitution is set up, they couldn't just gather signatures and put the law on hold and put it up for a statewide recall before the state decided whether or not it would go into effect. Instead, in Wisconsin, they used the one option that they had. They decided to put the governor himself up for a recall. That election, their attempt to recall Governor Scott Walker, is going to happen on Tuesday. But here's the most important thing we have learned since this whole fight started. Since this whole fight started with all of these Republican governors winning in 2010, with all of these legislatures going red, with all of them pursuing the same agenda, with the Beltway ignoring it because it was in the states and people only like to cover stuff that happens in Washington, D.C., here's the most important thing that we have learned. Wisconsin's law went into effect. It has served the purpose the Republicans intended for it. They have succeeded in effectively killing the unions in Wisconsin. This shows union membership nationwide from the 1950s down to the present. The decline you see has been driven by one factor, by corporations getting their way, getting non-union workforces in the private sector. But even with this precipitous decline in union membership over the decades, still nearly 1 in 8 American workers belongs to a union. And that's because public sector unions have held on. They have remained stable, even as membership in private unions has gone through the floor. That public sector unions have remained relatively strong has really big implications for Americans who work for a living. I mean, specifically for Americans who work as teachers and bus drivers and so on. It makes a very big difference. And whether those working people are working for a living wage and have safety in their job that they want to bargain for and all that stuff. But that also supports all working class wages. Right? So the strength of public sector unions has been important economically in this country to people who have to work for a living. The fact that unions still exist supports everybody's wages and everybody's workplace environment. But the fact that public sector unions still exist also has some very blunt political implications. We've shown this chart a bunch of times on this show. Every time we show this, we get people saying, why don't you show that chart more often? So here it is, popular request. These were the heavyweights when it came to outside spending in the 2010 election cycle. These were the 10 groups that spent the most money on that election that year. 6 of the 10 spent big time on the right. They spent on the Republican side. They were led by the corporate-funded U.S. Chamber of Commerce, far and away the biggest spender in 2010. Almost all of the groups spending on behalf of Republicans in 2010 were corporate-funded groups like that, business groups, right? The only major spenders on the other side, the only major spenders on behalf of Democrats in 2010 were unions. And that was it. They made up only 3 of the top 10 spenders. The only thing that Democrats had were unions. If you kill public sector unions in Wisconsin, you can kill unions altogether in Wisconsin. And you can therefore kill this key source of Democratic strength. It's true around the country. They're doing it in Wisconsin. In Wisconsin, Republicans set out to kill the unions, and that is what they have done. Look at this headline in the Wall Street Journal. Look at this. Wisconsin unions see ranks drop ahead of recall vote. It's kind of stunning. Look at this. This is the membership for Wisconsin's second largest union of public sector workers, AFSCME. This is before the union stripping law. Here's that same union's membership today. We don't have the stats on all the public unions in Wisconsin, but what we have all looks the same. This is the membership of the American Federation of Teachers in Wisconsin before the union stripping law went into effect. And this is the membership now in the teachers union. a year after Scott Walker's law took effect. That's what they've been able to do in a year. Now, because they could not stop the implementing of this law, the Democratic side in the Wisconsin recall effort doesn't have the means to compete politically that they usually have. Unions play a political role. To the extent that unions are going away, they can play less of a political role. That's a big reason why the Republican side have had a spending advantage in this campaign that at times has reached 25-1. $25 on the Republican side for every single dollar on the Democratic side. This recall election on Tuesday, even so, is really close. I mean, Democrats might yet pull it off. They say that the ground game is key. Who used to be best at the ground game? Unions. Killing off the unions is what Republicans want to do in every state in the country. That is why Scott Walker is the poster boy for the Republican Party this year. Republicans understand that this is the way they can win, not just now, not just in the current election cycle, but forever. Republicans get this, and they want it to happen in every state in the country. Republicans get this. Do Democrats get it? Do Democrats understand what's at stake here? Joining us now is my friend Ed Schultz. He is the host of The Ed Show on MSNBC, and he is somebody who definitely gets it. Ed, thank you so much for spending part of your Friday night with me. I really appreciate it, man.
Thank you, Rachel. I appreciate it very much.
How much does it matter for Democrats in Wisconsin that what we know about union membership since this law went into effect shows that unions have already had their teeth knocked out? They've already been decimated. How do you think that affects their chances in the recall next week?
Well, I think it has certainly hindered their ground game a little bit. But there's a mental aspect that goes with this right now. And that is the people of Wisconsin have seen terrible cuts in education that they are philosophically against. When I'm around the state, I hear it time and time again. I hear it on the radio. They don't believe that this is the right way to balance the budget. And the other hand of it is what you pointed out, how they're chipping away at the infrastructure of the voting bloc. They're chipping away at the infrastructure of the social networking, the door-to-door, the boots on the ground, because this is really the only thing the Democrats really have when it comes to getting the vote out and fighting against all this money that is being thrown into Wisconsin. Rachel, I think it's fair to say that Scott Walker is a very challenged candidate. He's a very challenged when it comes to his credibility and